The telegraph message had been terse, confirming only the arrival time and the name on the ticket. It had cost Arthur Bishop a month's savings to arrange, a desperate gamble made in the quiet shame of a failing ranch. He had imagined a woman sturdy and plain, someone accustomed to hardship, someone who would understand that his proposal was less about romance and more about the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. The Homestead Act required a family or a head of household, and his bachelor claim on the parched acres outside Promise Creek, Montana, was looking more precarious by the day. He needed a wife, and the agency in San Francisco had promised a respectable widow. He stood on the splintered planks of the platform, the summer sun beating down on his worn hat, and watched the Union Pacific engine hiss to a stop, a great iron beast breathing steam into the vast, indifferent sky. The passengers who disembarked were few. A pair of drummers in city suits, a stern-faced woman with a traveling case, a handful of dusty men heading for the mines. Arthur scanned their faces, a knot of anxiety tightening in his gut. There was no one who fit the description, no one who looked like a woman ready to start a new life on the edge of nothing. Then, he saw her. The last one off the car. She was small, dressed in dark, unfamiliar clothing, her black hair pulled into a severe knot. Her face was a mask of calm, but it was the face of a woman who had seen at least 40 hard years, her eyes holding a depth he couldn't begin to read. And she was Chinese. A cold dread washed over him. This was a mistake. A terrible, public mistake. The station master, a portly man named Jedediah who was known to be in the pocket of the valley's cattle baron, Bartholomew Thorne, sauntered over, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He held out a manifest. "This yours, Bishop?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the loiterers on the platform to hear. He pointed a thick finger at a name. Linmai. Arthur felt his face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He didn't answer. Jedediah chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Got a letter here for you, too." Came with her ticket. He handed over a sealed envelope. Arthur's hands trembled as he opened it. The note inside was brief, unsigned, and dripping with malice. "Heard you were looking for a wife to save that dirt patch of yours. Thought you could use one with experience. This one's been around. Should be grateful for whatever you can give her." A gift from a concerned neighbor. The laughter from the onlookers was a physical blow. It was Thorne's doing. A cruel, calculated joke to humiliate him in front of the whole town. Thorne wanted his land, everyone knew it. He'd been trying to buy Arthur out for a year, coveting the creek that ran through the property. This was his new tactic. To make Arthur a laughingstock, to break his spirit. Arthur looked at the woman, Linmai, who stood with an unnerving stillness, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the distant, hazy line of the mountains. She had not reacted to the laughter, to the sneers. She simply waited, a small, solitary figure in a world that had clearly conspired against her. He had two choices. He could send her back, deepening his debt and admitting defeat. Or he could accept the humiliation, claim this stranger as his intended, and walk out of Promise Creek with the punchline to Thorne's joke on his arm. The wagon ride back to the homestead was a study in suffocating silence. The only sounds were the creak of the axles, the plodding of the two old mules, and the vast, humming emptiness of the Montana plains. Arthur kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, the muscles in his jaw so tight they ached. He could feel her presence beside him, a weight both physical and symbolic. He had not spoken a word to her since helping her onto the wagon bench, a gesture of basic decency that felt like a surrender. He had simply nodded, taken the small, cloth-wrapped bundle that seemed to be her only possession, and turned the wagon toward home. He felt her gaze on him from time to time, but when he risked a glance, she was always looking away, her eyes scanning the landscape with an intensity that unsettled him. She wasn't looking at it as a passenger would. She was studying it, her gaze lingering on the types of grasses, the gentle folds in the land, the way the cottonwoods clustered near the almost dry creek bed. It was the look of a person reading a map written in a language he didn't know. His ranch, when it came into view, was a stark testament to his struggles. A small, unpainted clapboard cabin, a leaning barn, and a few corrals holding a herd of cattle so thin you could count their ribs. The grass in his pastures was brown and brittle, scorched by the unrelenting summer. This was what he had brought her to. A joke built on a foundation of failure. He pulled the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard and finally turned to face her. "This is it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew she wouldn't understand them, but the meaning was plain enough in the sweep of his hand, in the slump of his shoulders. She looked at the cabin, then at the barn, her expression unreadable. She slid down from the wagon seat before he could offer a hand, her movements economical and precise. She walked not to the house, but to the water trough near the corral. The water was low and murky. She dipped her fingers in, rubbing them together, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she walked to the edge of the nearest pasture, crumbled a handful of the dry soil, and brought it to her nose, inhaling its scent as if it were a fine perfume. Arthur watched, bewildered. He had expected tears, or fear, or perhaps the hard-bitten resignation of a woman sold from one bad situation to another. He had not expected this quiet, methodical inspection. It was as if she were a general surveying a battlefield, assessing its weaknesses and potential. He felt a flicker of something other than shame, a spark of curiosity. Who was this woman? What life had she led that brought her to this moment, to this place of dust and despair, with such composure? He had been so consumed by his own humiliation that he hadn't truly considered hers. She was a pawn in Thorne's game, a human being shipped across the country like freight, delivered as an insult. Yet she stood there, in the middle of his failing dream, with more dignity than anyone on that train platform, including himself. She turned back to him, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. It was a gesture that said, "I see what this is." Now, the work begins. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer awkward. It was expectant. The next morning, the first crisis arrived. A young heifer, one of the few promising calves from the spring, was down in the far pasture. Its breathing was ragged, its eyes were glazed with fever. Arthur knew the signs. It was lung sickness, a plague that could sweep through a herd and wipe a man out. The practical thing, the only thing, was to put the animal out of its misery and drag the carcass far from the others. He went to the barn for his rifle, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. That calf represented a significant portion of his assets, and now it was just another loss to be absorbed. When he came out, Linmai was standing by the corral, watching him. She must have seen him go out to the pasture and come back with his face set like granite. As he walked toward the sick animal, she stepped into his path. She held up a hand, a clear gesture to stop. She shook her head firmly. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough. "She's suffering." It's a kindness. He tried to step around her, but she moved with him, a small, unmovable obstacle. She pointed to the calf, then to her own chest, and made a soft, rasping sound. She was mimicking the animal's labored breathing. Then she pointed to the sun and held up one finger. One day. That's what she was asking for. Arthur stared at her, exasperated. Wasting a day would only prolong the animal's pain and risk the infection spreading. It made no sense. "There's nothing to be done," he insisted, more forcefully this time. But she did not flinch. She simply stood her ground, her eyes pleading with an intensity that gave him pause. There was no fear in her face, only a fierce, unyielding certainty. Against his better judgment, against every instinct of a rancher who knew the cruel finality of this land, he found himself hesitating. What was one more day in a lifetime of hardship? He lowered the rifle and gave a short, frustrated nod. One day, he conceded. Her response was immediate. She didn't thank him or show any sign of relief. She turned and walked away from the homestead, heading out onto the open plains with a burlap sack he hadn't noticed her grab from the barn. He watched her go, a small figure shrinking against the vast landscape, her purpose a complete mystery. He spent the rest of the morning moving the other cattle to a different pasture, a precaution that felt futile. By midday, the heat was a suffocating blanket. He saw a pair of riders on the ridge overlooking his property. Thorn's men. They sat on their horses for a long time, watching, no doubt sent to report on the state of his misery. They would see the sick calf, see him doing nothing, and ride back to Thorn with news of his incompetence. The humiliation burned anew. It was almost a relief when Lin Mai returned late in the afternoon. Her sack was full. She knelt beside the ailing calf without a moment's rest. She emptied her sack, revealing a collection of roots, leaves, and pale, lumpy fungi he had never seen before. She crushed some of the leaves with a rock, mixing them with a little water from his canteen to form a paste, which she gently forced into the heifer's mouth. She boiled the roots in a small pot over a fire she built with practiced efficiency, letting the steam wash over the animal's face. She worked with a silent, focused grace, her hands moving with a knowledge that was clearly ancient and deeply ingrained. Arthur stood back, a spectator to a ritual he could not comprehend, feeling useless on his own land. He was the rancher. He was supposed to be the one who knew things. But he had never seen anything like this. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The calf was still alive, its breathing perhaps a fraction less strained. It was not a miracle, not yet, but it was something. It was more than the nothing he had offered. The calf was alive the next morning. It was weak, but it was standing, its head lifted, its eyes clearer. By evening, it was taking water. Within 3 days, it was back with the herd, shaky but recovering. Arthur was stunned into a profound silence. He had been ready to destroy a life, and she had saved it with weeds and fungus from the plains. The incident shifted something between them, breaking down a wall of unspoken assumptions. He began to see her not as the symbol of his shame, but as a person of deep and mysterious capability. He found himself watching her, trying to understand her world. She moved through her days with a quiet rhythm, her work following the sun. She tended a small garden she'd started behind the cabin, coaxing green shoots from the unforgiving soil. She repaired his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was never idle, yet never seemed rushed. Her presence filled the small cabin, not with noise, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent for a very long time. One afternoon, Bartholomew Thorn rode into the yard. He dismounted from his fine, tall bay, his expensive saddle leather creaking in the stillness. He was a big man, dressed in a tailored coat despite the heat, his face smooth and confident. He radiated an aura of wealth and power that made Arthur's simple homestead feel even more pathetic. "Bishop," Thorn said, his voice a smooth baritone that didn't quite mask its condescending edge. "Just riding the line. Thought I'd stop in and see how you were settling in with your new arrangement." His eyes flickered toward the cabin door, where Lin Mai had appeared, her face impassive. "A man in your position needs help, of course. Though I confess, I'm surprised at the choice. The agency must be running low on suitable stock." Arthur's hand tightened into a fist at his side. "She's a hard worker," Thorn. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Thorn smiled, a cold, thin expression. "I'm sure. But hard work can't make it rain. This valley is drying up. A man with a small herd and no reserves, well, it's a difficult position." He let the threat hang in the air. "My offer still stands, Arthur. A fair price for the land. Enough to set you up somewhere else. Somewhere easier." Arthur looked from Thorn's smug face to his own thin cattle, to the dusty ground. The offer was tempting. It was a door out of a room that was slowly running out of air. But then he looked at Lin Mai. She was watching Thorn, her eyes narrowed with an unnerving, analytical stillness. It was the same look she'd had when she assessed the sick calf. She was weighing him, judging him. And in that moment, Arthur knew he couldn't sell. It would be a betrayal, not just of his own dream, but of the strange, silent partnership that was beginning to form within these cabin walls. "The land's not for sale," Arthur said, his voice steadier than he felt. Thorn's smile tightened. "A pity. A man ought to know when to fold a losing hand." He mounted his horse, but as he turned to leave, he glanced one last time at Lin Mai. "Be careful she doesn't cost you more than you can afford, Bishop." As Thorn rode away, Arthur noticed the dark, wet mud caked high on his horse's legs. It was mud from the high country, from the wetlands around the spring that fed his creek. No one had any reason to be up there. A cold knot of suspicion formed in his stomach. Thorn wasn't just waiting for him to fail. He was actively working on it. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Arthur sat at the small wooden table, the deed to his land spread out before him. The paper was worn at the creases, the ink faded. It was his only claim to a place in the world, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. He needed to make her understand. He pointed to the deed, then to the land outside, trying to convey the idea of ownership, of the threat Thorn represented. He wasn't sure if she understood his gestures, but she watched his face, her expression one of deep concentration. After he finished his clumsy pantomime of Thorn trying to take the land, she sat motionless for a long moment. Then, she rose and went to her small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She untied it carefully, revealing not clothes, but a collection of dried plants, seeds in small pouches, and a few smooth, dark stones. It was a naturalist's collection, a healer's kit. But she ignored all of that. From the very bottom, she pulled out a thin, folded piece of rice paper. She laid it on the table next to his deed. It was covered in Chinese characters, beautifully rendered with a brush, but meaningless to him. At the bottom, however, was a drawing. It was a diagram, intricate and precise, showing the flow of water through a series of terraces, channels, and ponds. It depicted a system for managing water, for capturing every drop and using it to cultivate life in a dry landscape. She tapped the drawing, then pointed out the window toward the dying creek. She looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. She was not just a woman who knew how to use herbs. Her knowledge was far deeper. It was systematic, scientific. He was looking at a plan, a strategy for survival that was more sophisticated than anything he could have conceived. He had seen a useless bride, a victim. He was beginning to realize he was in the presence of an engineer. His newfound hope was short-lived. The next week, the creek slowed to a trickle. Within days, it was nothing more than a series of stagnant pools. The drought was tightening its grip, but this was more than nature. This was sabotage. Arthur saddled his horse and rode upstream, his gut churning with a sick certainty. He found it 2 miles onto his own property, just past the boundary with Thorn's vast ranch. A crude but effective dam, built of rocks and logs, diverted the entire flow of the creek into a ditch that led directly toward Thorn's pastures. His men had worked fast and they had worked on Arthur's land. It was a brazen act of theft, a declaration of war without a single shot fired. Anger, hot and pure, surged through him. He rode on, following the diverted water, until he saw Thorn's men, a half-dozen of them, lounging in the shade of a cottonwood, watching their stolen water fill one of Thorn's reservoirs. Thorn himself was there, overseeing the work. He saw Arthur approach and smiled that same cold, confident smile. "Bishop." Taking in the scenery. "This is my water," Arthur said, his voice shaking with rage. "And you're on my land," Thorn feigned surprise. "Your land? I don't believe so. I filed a new claim on this tributary last month. All perfectly legal." The territorial office agreed that the water was being insufficiently utilized in its previous course. He produced a sheaf of papers from his bag. They looked official, stamped with seals Arthur didn't recognize but which carried the undeniable weight of authority. "The law is on my side, Bishop. You can't prove a thing. Now, I suggest you ride back to your dusty little farm before you're charged with trespassing." The men with him chuckled, their hands resting near their pistols. It was a checkmate. Thorn hadn't just stolen his water, he had used the law to sanctify the theft. Arthur was alone, outmaneuvered, and powerless. There was nothing he could do. The fight went out of him, replaced by a hollow, crushing defeat. He turned his horse around and rode home, the sight of his own water flowing onto his enemy's land burning in his mind. He had lost. The ranch was finished. He stumbled into the cabin, the official-looking papers from Thorn clutched in his hand. He threw them on the table, the sound echoing the collapse of his hopes. "Here's one," he said to the quiet room, to her. He took the water. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He didn't know how to explain the finality of it, the legal trap that Thorn had sprung. He felt a light touch on his shoulder. Lin Mai stood beside him. She picked up the papers he had thrown down. She couldn't read the words, but she spent a long time studying the surveyor's map that was attached, her finger tracing the lines of the creek, the boundaries of his property, the new channel Thorn had dug. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration. After several minutes, she put the papers down. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a spark of something like anger in her eyes. It was a cold, controlled fire. She walked to the door and beckoned for him to follow. He did so numbly, expecting nothing. She didn't lead him toward the stolen creek. Instead, she started climbing, heading up into the rocky, scrub-covered hills at the back of his property, a section of his land he considered worthless, good for nothing but rattlesnakes and coyotes. They walked for nearly an hour, the sun beating down on them. He was about to protest, to tell her it was useless, when she stopped. They were in a small, shaded ravine he had never bothered to explore. Tucked back under a granite overhang, almost completely hidden by a thicket of wild brush, was a patch of vibrant green. Water seeped from a fissure in the rock, slow but steady, pooling in a small basin before disappearing back into the ground. It was a spring. A hidden spring, on his own land, that he never knew existed. He stared, dumbfounded. It wasn't a large flow, not nearly enough to replace the creek. He started to tell her this, but she held up a hand for silence. She pointed to the plants growing around the spring, then to the ground, showing him the faint tracks of deer and other animals. This place was a secret source of life. Then she took a piece of charcoal from her pouch and, on the flat surface of a large rock, she began to draw. She sketched his land, Thorn's land, the now dry creek. Then, she drew the spring. But she didn't stop there. She drew a series of lines beneath the surface of the ground, lines that connected this hidden spring to the much larger one on Thorn's property. She was showing him that they were part of the same underground aquifer. Thorn hadn't just stolen the surface water, he was drawing from the same deep well that fed this place. Then came her masterstroke. She drew a new design. She sketched a plan for digging, for lining a deep basin with clay from the creek bed, for creating a reservoir right here, fed by this secret spring. A reservoir that would hold the slow, steady flow and store it. It would be an immense amount of work, a back-breaking gamble. But looking at the calm certainty in her eyes and the elegant logic of her drawing, he felt a flicker of hope ignite in the desolate landscape of his heart. Thorn thought he had taken everything. He had no idea that the real treasure was still hidden. The work was brutal. For the next 6 months, they toiled from sunup to sundown. They dug with shovels and a mule-drawn scraper, carving a deep bowl out of the earth below the spring. The ground was hard, baked by years of sun, but they persisted. Arthur's hands, already calloused, bled and blistered and healed into thicker, tougher hide. Lin Mai worked alongside him, her small frame housing a strength and stamina that defied all expectation. She showed him which clay from the dry creek bed was best for lining the reservoir, how to tamp it down to create a waterproof seal. Slowly, painstakingly, the reservoir took shape. As it did, she began to change the way he managed his herd. She had him fence the pastures, rotating the cattle from one to another, giving the native grasses time to recover. She pointed out certain plants she called strong grass and had him gather the seeds to sow in the resting fields. She was healing the land itself. The first winter snows came, and the slow trickle from the spring continued, gradually filling their new reservoir. They survived the winter on salted meat and what little they had stored, their shared labor forging a bond stronger than any vows. They had a language now, a mix of his simple English, her few learned words, and the complex grammar of gestures and shared understanding. When spring arrived, their world had been transformed. The reservoir was full, a placid turquoise eye reflecting the vast Montana sky. The pastures, rested and reseeded, came in thick and green. The cattle, with clean water and good grass, were thriving. They were sleek and healthy, their coats shining. Word began to spread. Other ranchers, struggling with the lingering drought, rode out to see Arthur Bishop's miracle. They saw his fat cattle, his green grass, and the quiet Chinese woman who stood beside him, and they left with a new respect, the memory of Thorne's joke forgotten. Buyers from the east began to arrive, not at Thorne's ranch, but at Arthur's, paying premium prices for his healthy stock. He paid off his debts. He bought more land, not downstream, but upstream, securing the entire watershed around his hidden spring. He was no longer a failure. He was a success, built on the knowledge of a woman the world had dismissed as useless. One day in late summer, a year after her arrival, Bartholomew Thorne rode into his yard again. He looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of desperation. His own cattle were thin, his pastures were brown. His grand water theft had been a short-term victory that had ultimately damaged the wider water table, diminishing his own mainspring. He had won the battle but lost the war. "Bishop," he said, his voice strained. I've come to make a proposal. I need water. I'm prepared to pay you for access to your reservoir." Arthur looked at him, then at Linmai, who stood on the porch of the now painted and expanded cabin. She met his gaze, her expression calm. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, unshakable peace. She had not sought revenge. She had simply built a better world in the space she had been given. Arthur turned back to Thorne. "There's no water for sale here, Thorne," he said, his voice even. "My water is for my land. And my family." He said the word family and looked at Linmai, and in that moment, it was the truest thing he had ever said. Thorne stared for a moment, the full measure of his defeat finally dawning on him. He had tried to break a man with a cruel joke, and instead, he had given him the one person in the world who could save him. He turned his horse and rode away, a diminished figure against the backdrop of Arthur's prosperity. A few weeks later, the train whistle blew in Promise Creek. Arthur and Linmai stood on the same platform where they had first met. But this time, they were not there to receive a delivery. They were watching their own cattle, the first of many shipments, being loaded onto cars bound for the Chicago stockyards. The foundation of the richest herd in the territory. Arthur looked at his wife, at the woman who had seen life in a dying land, who had built an empire from dust and water and knowledge. He still didn't know the whole story of the life she had lived before she came to him. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that some people see the world as it is and call it hopeless. And others see what it could be, and get to work. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.